Grudge of a Skinwalker. I was raised by my mother Meredith. We lived in a fairly isolated home that was closer to the forest than other neighboring households. Instead of humans, our frequent visitors were the critters and other animals who just casually hang around the garden. Aside from the lively raccoons and squirrels pestering the house, I often saw some doe with her cubs, foxes lurking about, and rabbits jumping around. Aside from these animals, I also encountered a forest inhabitant of an extraordinary kind. It was the kind that could reshape his form. He could be as small as a rat or as big as a bear. He could be a snake that slithers silently or a bird for the gift of flight. Back in my home, I encountered a being that was commonly referred to as a skinwalker. Since we lived so close to the forest, I learned how to respect nature and its inhabitants. We coexisted with it, but perhaps we were a little too close to it. According to Meredith, my grandfather died when he was attacked by a bear. Coincidentally, my father also died in the woods when he was mauled by a wolf. Due to these unfortunate incidents, I was well aware of the danger outside our home. One would think that we should have moved to a much safer environment, but Meredith was a proud wife. She didn't want to abandon the house which her husband had built with his own hands. Ever since I was a child, Meredith often told me stories about the shape-shifting entities who dwelled within the depths of the forest. I thought it was just her way of scaring me so I wouldn't wander too far outside, especially at night, but the amount of old and impractical weapons we had in display suggested otherwise. My grandfather and my father were hunters, and so I grew up surrounded by various hunting weapons. However, there were also some unconventional weapons displayed in our house. Including our fence, there were wooden blades made of white ash tree, there were spears with silver arrowheads, and there was a revolver loaded with silver bullets. All of our windows had metal railings, and we never turned our lights off in the garden during the night. As a child, I felt like we were living in a cage, but I soon realized the significance of these precautionary measures. My first encounter with a skinwalker was when I was 12 years old. I had a high fever, and Meredith had to leave me for a while to buy some medicine at the nearest town, which was roughly a 2-hour drive. We had a reliable neighbor that we always counted on who lived 40 miles away from our house. But Billy was busy with other things and couldn't watch over me at the time. When the night came, I heard someone knocking at the door. Meredith specifically told me that she would call on the phone before knocking, and I shouldn't let anyone in until she returns. The person behind the door was calling me out. It sounded like Meredith, but she did not call on the phone. My grandmother was already in her 60s at the time. There were days when Meredith would forget a lot of things, including her phone. With the chain lock on, I slightly opened the door just enough for me to see if it was really her. Her clothes, her face, and her body frame looked exactly like my grandmother. However, there was something that seemed a bit off. She had a blank expression on her face as she glared at me without blinking. I asked her why she didn't call first. With a noticeably monotonous voice, she said that she forgot her phone. In order to make sure, I decided to dial her number. After a few rings, Meredith answered, but it wasn't the person that was in front of me. Completely shaken and in disbelief, I immediately shut the door. My hands and knees were shuddering as I took a few steps back. Instead of screaming, I mustered all the courage I had in me and said, "We have a lot of weapons here, you should go away." After a few seconds of silence, I heard her footsteps on the wooden floor of the porch. Fortunately, the imposter heeded my warning and walked away. When the real Meredith heard what happened, she called for Billy, who rushed to our house fully armed with a rifle and a revolver. My grandmother got back a few moments later and promised not to leave me alone again. I realized then the stories were real, and it wasn't the last time that I would encounter this thing. 7 years after the incident, I moved to the city for my studies. Despite of the long travel I had to take, I visited Meredith as often as I could to check on her. When I turned 21, she passed away. We didn't have any relatives in the country, and the only people who attended the funeral were Billy and a few acquaintances. Since there was nobody else, I ended up inheriting the house in the woods. I wanted to keep it as it was in respect to the memories of my childhood and my grandparents. But for some reason, Billy was strongly advising me to sell the property and create a new life in the city. Whatever I wanted to do with it was none of his business, and so I just politely ignored him. I had to stay at the house for a couple of more days to arrange the burial for Meredith, and it was then when I learned about the real story of my grandfather and the shape-shifting creature. Various methods were believed to be effective for killing a skinwalker. They said that it can be killed by mentioning its real name. Some said that a silver bullet or a silver blade might hurt it. There was also a belief that it would be warded off by white ash. These methods were unproven since most people didn't believe in skinwalkers to begin with, and it seemed that my grandfather had tried all of these methods in order to get rid of this enemy. But since the skinwalker was still alive, it was obvious that none of those things have worked. Meredith mentioned multiple times that grandfather was able to slay a skinwalker back then, but she never mentioned what weapon he used in order to do so. Apparently, all the things that happened in the past were witnessed by Billy. He stopped by the house and told me everything that I needed to know. Billy and my grandfather used to hunt together, and he told me that what my grandfather had killed wasn't a skinwalker. There was a small group of native Navajo tribe who also lived within the woods back then, and they also roamed around the woods from time to time. It was during their late night hunts when my grandfather made a big mistake, or rather, committed a crime. Without a clear vision, he shot an animal from afar which he thought was a boar. When it tried to run away, he shot it again and again until it was dead for good. However, the animal that he killed was not what he thought it was. Sadly, it was a young man wearing a boar's hide, and this man belonged to the Navajo tribe. Meredith learned what happened and immediately went to the tribe to try and aid the young man, but his wounds were too great that he passed away soon after. The father of the victim was deeply angered by what my grandfather did, and he swore an oath to avenge his death. He saw the genuine kindness and concern from Meredith, and so he excluded her from his revenge. However, the rest of our family were hunted since then. The father of the young Navajo turned to their dark ways and took the path of Yi Nald Lushi, which translates to he who walks in all fours. This dark practice had become the tragedy for my family. The Nald Lushi was said to be an adept of witchcraft, but he was feared the most because of his ability to transform into animals during the night. This very old practice was the origin of the skinwalker, but very little was known about it since the tribe didn't want to speak of it. Several years passed and the Navajo tribe left the forest. However, the father of the young man remained to extract his revenge. When my father and grandfather died from an animal attack, Billy believed that it was he who attacked them. Meredith never mentioned any of these things, but it was probably protecting the image of her husband to his grandson. The skinwalker never attacked the house whenever Meredith was around, and the only time when he showed up was when I was left alone. Since she was already dead, nobody would prevent him from coming. It also didn't help that I grew up to be a spitting image of my grandfather when he was my age. I was the only one left of my family, and Billy knew that the Nald Lushi would come for me. When the sun went down after my grandmother's burial, his assumption was proven right. Knowing what might happen, Billy stayed for the night and brought a lot of weapons. Along with my grandfather's stash and his, the place looked like we were fully prepared for war. Since the white ash and the silvers didn't work, I opted for a practical choice and grabbed a shotgun loaded with 12-gauge slugs. If the supernatural methods was ineffective, then I would simply blow up gaping holes in his body until nothing's left. For my own sake and for the safety of my future family, I had to face the skinwalker and end his grudge once and for all. Our lights outside were shown right in front of the garden, but beyond that was nothing but darkness and silhouettes of the trees. After a few hours of paranoia and preparation, we heard a howl coming from afar. A few moments later, we heard some rustling from the shrubs. Despite of all these weapons and resolve, Billy and I were still frightened to the core. We were about to be confronted by a supernatural being that killed my father and grandfather. Billy propped up his rifle at the window and was ready to fire if something would come out from the dark, but he suddenly stepped back with his eyes wide open while mumbling incoherently. I asked him what he saw, but he was in shock and couldn't respond. The next thing I heard was the creaking of the wooden floor. The skinwalker was already on the porch. I began to sweat profusely. I removed my finger from the trigger since my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I thought that I could muster the courage when this particular moment would come, but I realized that I wasn't ready for this confrontation at all. A few seconds later, someone knocked at the door, and when he finally spoke, tears ran across my face as he mimicked a very familiar voice. Because of the voice, I eagerly opened the door a little with the chain lock on. Standing at the porch was the skinwalker possessing the figure of Meredith, who just passed away. Despite of the fear and overwhelming tension, I was suddenly stricken with sadness. I was longing to see my grandmother for the last time, and it was maliciously granted by an entity who came to kill us. Billy pulled me back when the skinwalker tried to lure me by calling my name, and I came back to my senses after staring at the face of the imposter for a while. Billy moved in front of me and pointed his rifle out the door. He reluctantly fired the first shot, and the skinwalker was taken aback. The first shot hit him right on the chest, and it infuriated him. He shrilled and shrieked as he stepped off the porch and stood at the garden. When he realized that his trick wouldn't work, the skinwalker decided to take another form. He shed off his clothes like an old layer of skin and grew bigger while his head was transforming into that of a ram's. His feet and hands turned into hooves, and he stood on all fours. Billy stepped outside and kept on firing while the skinwalker was transforming, but the shots were not enough to stop him. I was too baffled by what was happening right in front of me that I couldn't move from where I stood. When Billy realized that the skinwalker was about to charge towards us, he repeatedly called me out until I reacted. I stepped outside and pointed the shotgun right at the skinwalker. As he aggressively lunged forward, I instinctively pulled the trigger. The devastating impact of the slug round ripped off his front leg, and the next shot shattered his shoulder completely. After seeing how effective my shots were, I aimed at his limbs until he was incapacitated. Billy took out his revolver while I was reloading my gun, and he repeatedly fired at the skinwalker's head until he was out of bullets. But despite of all the shots that he received, the skinwalker was still alive. His body jolted in place and started shrinking. He was about to take another form again in order to escape. He began to hiss as his body grew longer while getting significantly slimmer. He was turning into a snake, but we didn't give him a chance to completely transform. I fired right into his head, but what remained of his body still kept on moving. Billy grabbed him from the ground and threw him into a barrel. I grabbed a bottle of gasoline and we lit him on fire. We watched him burn until nothing was left of him. It took a lot of bullets and courage, but we were finally able to kill the skinwalker that hunted my family.